Alright, what is up? Oh wait, the music's looping. There we go, that's better. Alright, anyway, what's up? We're here. It's cool. Homework stream day 2. Some people joining the homework stream for the first time are gonna be here. Some people joining the stream because they were here yesterday. Pretty cool. I'm gonna mess with the audio real quick to make sure that they're kind of balanced. Some of them, the music seems a little loud. I'll try to fix that. Alright, cool. Anyway, yeah, we're all here, I think. Cool. What homework do I have? I have to read my AP US History book. In fact, I have another screen for this. Boom. Currently reading AP US History and Government. Pretty cool, right? I may not actually remember exactly what I'm supposed to be reading. I think it's like 33 to 45. If somebody's in my class, tell me what we're reading to. I'm just gonna start reading. Hopefully I remember. But I know where I'm starting at least, so we'll go there. Alright. On page 33, well, okay, so first of all, the book we're reading, the 2016 Presidential Election Edition, AP Edition, of Government in America, People, Politics, and Policy. On page 33 is where we're going to be starting, and I think it goes to like 45. We'll see. Making a Constitution, the Philadelphia Convention. Representatives from but I already messed up. That's a great start to this. Representatives from 12 states came to Philadelphia to heed the Continental Congress's call to take into consideration the situation in the United States. Only Rhode Island, a stronghold of paper money interests and thus skeptical of reforms favoring creditors, refused to send delegates. Virginia's Patrick Henry, the colonial firebrand who had declared, "Give me liberty or give me death," feared a centralization of power and also did not attend. The delegates were ordered to meet for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. The Philadelphia delegates did not pay much attention to this, however, because amending the Articles required the unanimous consent of the states, which they knew would be impossible. Thus, the 55 delegates ignored their instructions and began writing what was to become the U.S. Constitution. Gentlemen in Philadelphia. Who were these 55 men? They may not have been demigods, as Jefferson perhaps sarcastically called them, but they were certainly an elite group of economic and political notables. They were mostly wealthy planters, successful or once successful lawyers, and merchants, and men of independent wealth. Many were college graduates, and most had practical political experience. Most were coastal residents rather than residents of the expanding western frontiers, and a significant number were urbanites rather than part of the primarily rural American population. Philosophy into action. The delegates in Philadelphia were an uncommon combination of philosophers and shrewd political architects. Their debates ranged from high principles on the big issues to self-interest on the small ones. The delegates devoted the first 2 weeks mainly to general debates about the nature of Republican government which ultimate power rests with the voters. After that, practical and divisive issues sometimes threatened to dissolve the meeting. Obviously, the 55 delegates did not share the same political philosophy. For example, Democratic Benjamin Franklin held very different views from those delegates who were wary of democracy. Yet the founders shared a common core of ideas. The group agreed on the critical questions of 1. Human nature, 2. The causes of political conflict, 3. The objects of government, and 4. The nature of a republican government. Human nature. In his famous work titled Leviathan, written in 1651, Thomas Hobbes argued that a man's natural state was war, and that a strong, absolute leader was necessary to restrain man's bestial tendencies. Without a strong government, Hobbes wrote, life would be a solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short one. The delegates agreed with Hobbes that people were naturally self-interested, and that government should play a key role in restraining selfish impulses. However, the framers opposed the powerful monarch. They sided with Locke's argument that government should be limited. Political conflict. Of all the words written by and about the delegates, none have been more widely quoted than these by James Madison of Federalist 10. The most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. In other words, the distribution of wealth. Land was the main form of wealth these days. There's a parentheses and then I got confused on what emphasis to put on the words. Anyway, those who hold and those who are without property, Madison went on, have ever formed distinct interests in society. Other sources of conflict include religion, views of governing, and attachment to various leaders. Arising from these sources of conflict are factions, what today we might call interest groups. A majority faction might well be composed of those who have little or no property. A minority faction of those without property. The delegates thought if one of these factions went unchecked, it would eventually tyrannize. It's like tyrannical, but it's tyrannize. Anyway, the delegates thought that if one of these factions was unchecked, it would eventually tyrannize the other. The majority would try to seize the government to reduce the wealth of the minority. The minority would try to seize the government to secure its own gains. Governments run by factions, the founders believed, are prone to instability, tyranny, and even violence. The framers intended to check the effects of factions. Purpose of government. To Governor Morris of Pennsylvania, the preservation of property was the principal object of government. Morris plainly overlooked some other purposes of government, including providing security from invasion, ensuring domestic peace, and promoting the public health and welfare. However, Morris's remark typifies the philosophy of many of the delegates. As property holders themselves, these delegates could not imagine a government that did not make its principal objective an economic one, the preservation of individual rights to acquire and hold wealth. A few, like Morris, were intent on shutting out the property list altogether. Give the votes to people who have no property, Morris claimed, and they will sell them to the rich who will be able to buy them. Nature of government. Given their beliefs about human nature, the causes of political conflict, the need to protect property, and the threat of tyranny by a faction, what sort of government did the delegates believe could work? They answered this question in different ways, but the message was always the same. Power should be set against... Power should be set against power so that no one faction would overwhelm the others. The secret of good government is balanced government. They were influenced by the writings of French aristocrat Baron Montesquieu, who advocated separate branches of government, each of which had distinct powers and the ability to check the other branches. The framers agreed, concluding that a limited government would have to involve checks on its own power. So long as no faction could seize the whole of government at once, tyranny could be avoided. A balanced government requires a complex network of checks and balances and a separation of powers. Critical issues at the convention. The delegates in Philadelphia did not wish merely to construct a government from the ideas. They wanted to design a government that was consistent with their unique political philosophy. They also had to confront some of the thorniest issues facing the fledgling nation at the time. Issues of equality, the economy, and individual rights. The equality issues. The Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal. The Constitution, however, is silent on equality. Nevertheless, some of the most important issues on the framers' policy agenda concerned equality. 3 issues occupied much of their attention: whether the states were to be equally represented, what to do about slavery, and whether to ensure equality in voting. Representation of the states. One crucial policy issue was how to constitute the new Congress. The New Jersey Plan, proposed by William Paterson of New Jersey, called for each state to be equally represented in the new Congress. The opposing strategy, suggested by Edmund Randolph of Virginia, is usually termed the Virginia Plan. It called for giving each state representation in Congress based on the state's share of the American population. The delegates resolved this conflict with a compromise devised by Roger Sherman and William Johnson of Connecticut. The solution, proposed in what is known as the Connecticut Compromise, was to create two houses of Congress. We're on page 36, by the way. One body, the Senate, would have 2 members from each state, the New Jersey Plan, and the second, the House of Representatives, would have representation based on population, the Virginia Plan. The U.S. Congress is still organized in exactly this way. Each state has 2 senators, and a state's population determines its representation in the House. Although the Connecticut Compromise was intended to maximize equality among the states, it actually gives more power to people who live in states with small populations than to those who live in more heavily populated states. Every state has 2 senators and at least 1 member of the House, no matter how small its population. To take the most extreme case, Wyoming and California have the same number of votes in the Senate, 2, although Wyoming has less than 2% of California's population. Thus, a citizen of Wyoming has about 70 times the representation in the Senate as does a citizen of California. Because it is the Senate, not the House, that ratifies treaties, confirms put the wrong emphasis on the words there. Because it is the Senate, not the House, that ratifies treaties, confirms presidential nominations, and hears trials of impeachment, citizens in less populated states have a greater say in these key tasks. In addition, in presidential elections, the Electoral College gives smaller states greater weight. And if no presidential candidate receives a majority in the Electoral College, the House of Representatives makes the final decision, with each state having 1 vote. In such a case, which has not occurred since 1824, the votes of citizens of Wyoming would again carry about 70 times as much weight as those of Californians. Whether representation in the Senate is fair is a matter of debate. What is not open to question is about how the framers had to accommodate various interests and viewpoints in order to convince all the states to join an untested union. Slavery. The second equality issue was slavery. The contradictions between slavery and the sentiments of the Declaration of Independence are obvious, but in 1787, slavery was legal in every state except Massachusetts. It was concentrated in the South, however, where slave labor was commonplace in agriculture. Some delegates, like Gouverneur Morris, denounced slavery in no uncertain terms, but the convention could not accept Morris's position in the face of powerful Southern opposition led by Charles C. Pinckney of South Carolina. The delegates did not agree that Congress could limit the importing of slaves in the future. They allowed it to be outlawed after 1808, but they did not forbid slavery itself. The Constitution, in fact, inclines towards recognizing slavery, referring to slaves. It states that persons legally held to service or labor who escaped to free states had to be returned to their owners. How should slaves be counted regarding representation in the House? Southerners wanted slaves counted as part of the population, since doing so would increase their representation. However, they were reluctant to count slaves in determining each state's appointment of taxation. Northerners held the opposite position. The result was a famous 3/5 compromise. Representation in the House and taxation were to be based on the number of free persons, and a state plus 3/5 of the number of all other persons. Everyone, of course, knew who those other persons were. Equality in voting. The delegates dodged one other issue of equality. A handful of delegates, led by Benjamin Franklin, suggested that all free adult males should be able to vote in national elections. This still would have left a majority of the population disenfranchised, but for those still smarting from Shays' Rebellion, and the fear of mob rule, the suggestion was too democratic. Many delegates wanted to include property ownership as a qualification for voting. Ultimately, they decided to leave the rules on voting to the states. People qualified to vote in state elections could also vote in national elections. Table 2.3 summarizes how the founders dealt with the three issues of equality. I'm not reading 2.3. The economic issues. The Philadelphia delegates were deeply concerned about the state of American economy and wanted to strengthen it. Americans generally disagreed, in fact, historians still disagree, as to whether the post-colonial economy was in shambles. But there was a consensus among the writers of the Constitution that the economy was indeed in disarray and they needed to address the following problems. States had imposed tariffs on products from other states. Paper money was virtually worthless in some states. However, many state governments that were controlled by debtors forced it on creditors anyway. And Congress was having trouble raising money because the economy was in recession. Understanding something about the delegates and their economy interests gives us insight into their views on the role of government in the economy. They were members of the nation's economic elite. Some were budding capitalists. Others were creditors whose loans were being wiped out by cheap paper money. Many were merchants who, on account of tariffs, could not carry trade with neighboring states. Virtually all of them thought a strong national government was needed to bring economic stability to the chaotic union of states that existed under the Articles of Confederation. It is not surprising, then, that the framers of the Constitution would seek to strengthen the economic powers of the new national government. One famous historian, Charles A. Beard, claimed that their principal motivation for doing so was to increase their personal wealth. The framers, he said, were propertied upper-class men protecting their interests. They held bonds and investments whose value would increase if the Constitution were adopted. The best evidence, however, indicates that although the framers were concerned about protecting property rights, they were motivated primarily by a desire to build a strong economy rather than a narrow one of increasing their own personal wealth. The delegates made sure that the Constitution clearly spelled out the economic powers of Congress. Consistent with the general allocation of power in the Constitution, Congress was to be the chief economic policymaker. It could obtain revenues through taxing and borrowing. These tools, along with the power to appropriate funds, became crucial instruments for influencing the economy. By maintaining sound money and guaranteeing payments for the national debt, Congress was to encourage economic enterprise and investment in the United States. The Constitution also allocates to Congress power to build the nation's infrastructure by constructing post offices and roads and establishing standard weight and measurements. To protect property rights, Congress was charged with punishing counterfeiters and pirates, ensuring patents and congressional power. Ensuring patents and copyrights and legislating rules for bankruptcy. Equally important, and now a key congressional power with a wide range of implications for the economy, was Congress's new ability to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. In sum, the Constitution granted Congress the power to create the conditions within which markets could flourish. In addition, the framers prohibited practices in the states that they viewed as inhibiting economic development, such as maintaining individual state monetary systems, placing duties on imports from other states, and interfering with lawfully contracted debts. Moreover, the states were to respect civil judgments and contracts made in other states, and they were to return runaway slaves to their owners. To help the states, the national government guaranteed them a republican form of government, to prevent a reoccurrence of Shays' Rebellion, which in some people used violence instead of legislation, and the courts to resolve commercial disputes. Yes, this will be uploaded after it streams. It'll be up forever on here. Yeah. I probably should have wrote that down somewhere, but yeah, it'll be up after I stream it. The Constitution also obligated the new government to repay all the public debts incurred under the governments of the Continental Congress and the Articles of Confederation, debts that totaled $54 million. Paying off the debts would restore the confidence of investors in the young nation and ensure from the outset that money would flow into the American economy. That's actually important. Hold on. Everyone take a break real quick. I'm just gonna add a little thing that says this will be up after I stream. Alright, there we go. So now if anyone's wondering, once the stream is over, this will still be up in case you missed parts of it. Or if you just want to hear it again, I guess. Yeah, so we're continuing on page 39. The individual rights issues. Another major agenda item at the Constitutional Convention was designing a system that would preserve individual rights. There was no dispute about the importance of safeguarding individual rights and liberties, and the framers believed that doing this would be relatively easy. After all, they were constructing a limited government that, by design, could not threaten personal freedoms. In addition, they dispersed power among the three branches of the national government and between the national and state governments so that each branch or level could restrain the other. Also, most of the delegates believed that the states were already doing a sufficient job of protecting individual rights. As a result, the Constitution they drafted says little about personal freedoms. The protection it does offer are the following. It prohibits suspension of the writ of habeas corpus, such as such a court order enables persons detained by authorities to secure immediate inquiry into the causes of their detention. If no lawful explanation is offered, a judge may order their release. It prohibits Congress or the states from passing bills of attainder, which punish people without a judicial trial. It prohibits Congress or the states from passing ex post facto laws, which punish people for acts that were not illegal when they were done, or retroactively increase the penalties for illegal acts. It prohibits imposition of religious qualifications for holding office in the national government. It narrowly defines and outlaws strict rules of evidence for conviction of treason. To be convicted, a person must levy war against the United States or adhere to and aid its enemies during war. Conviction requires confession in open court or the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act. The founders would have been executed as traitors if the revolution had failed, and they were therefore sensitive to treason laws. It upholds the right to trial by jury in criminal cases. The delegates were content with their document. When it came time to ratify the Constitution, however, there were widespread criticism of the absence of specific protection of individual rights, such as free expression and various rights of the accused. The Madisonian system. The framers believed that human nature was self-interested, and that inequalities of wealth were the principal source of political conflict. Yet they had no desire to eliminate the economic divisions in society by converting private property to common ownership. They also believed that protecting private property was a key purpose of government. Their experience with state governments under the Articles of Confederation reinforced their view that democracy was a threat to property. Many of them felt that, if given political power, the non-wealthy majority, an unruly mob, would tyrannize the wealthy minority. Thus, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention faced the dilemma of reconciling economic inequality with political freedom. How could they devise a government that was responsive to the majority while protecting private property? Thwarting the tyranny of majority. James Madison was neither wealthy nor a great orator. He was, however, a careful student of politics and government and became the principal architect of the government's final structure, which we sometimes refer to as the Madisonian system. He and his colleagues feared both majority and minority factions. Either could take control of the government and use it to their own advantage. Factions of the minority, however, were easy to handle. The majority could simply outvote them. Factions of the majority were harder to handle. If the majority united around some policy issue, such as the redistribution of wealth, they could oppress the minority, violating the latter's basic rights. As Madison would later explain in Federalist 51, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and then in the next place oblige itself to control itself. To prevent the possibility of tyranny of the majority, Madison proposed the following. 1. Place as much of the government as possible beyond the direct control of the majority. 2. Separate the powers of different institutions. 3. Construct a system of checks and balances. Limiting majority control. Madison believed that to thwart tyranny by the majority, it was necessary to keep most of the government beyond their power. His plan, as shown in Figure 2.3, which I will not be reading, placed only one element of government, the House of Representatives, elected every 2 years, within direct control of the votes of the majority. In contrast, state legislatures were to elect senators, and special electors were to choose the president. In other words, a small minority, not the people themselves, would elect most government officials. The president was to nominate federal judges. Even if the majority seized control of the House of Representatives, they still could not enact policies without the agreement of the Senate and the president. To further insulate government officials from public union, the Constitution gives judges lifetime tenure and the senators terms of 6 years, with only 1/3 of the Senate elected every 2 years. Separating powers. The Madisonian scheme also provided for a separation of powers. Each of the 3 branches of government, executive, legislative, and judicial, would be relatively independent of one another so that no single branch could control the others. The framers gave the president, Congress, and the courts independent elements of power. The Constitution does not divide power absolutely, however. Instead, it shares it among the 3 institutions. Creating checks and balances. Because powers were not completely separate, each branch required the consent of the others for many of its actions. This created a system of checks and balances that reflected Madison's goal of setting power against power to constrain government actions. He reasoned that if a faction seized one institution, it still could not damage the whole system. The system of checks and balances was an elaborate and delicate creation. The president checks Congress by holding veto power. Congress, in turn, holds the purse strings of government, and the Senate must approve presidential nominations. The courts also were central to the system of checks and balances. Presidents can nominate judges, but these nominees must be confirmed by the Senate. In Marbury v. Madison, this is an important court trial. In Marbury v. Madison, the Supreme Court asserted its power to check the other branches through judicial review, which is the power to hold actions of the other 2 branches unconstitutional. This capacity considerably strengthens the court's ability to restrain other branches of government. For a summary of the separation of powers and the checks and balances system, see Figure 2.4. I will not be explaining Figure 2.4. Establishing a federal system. The framers also established a federal system of government that divides the power to govern between the national and state governments. Most government activity in the late 18th century occurred in the states. The framers thus saw the federal system as an additional check on the national government. The Constitutional Republic. When asked what kind of government the delegates had produced, Benjamin Franklin is said to have replied, "A republic if you can keep it." But the framers did not wish to have the people directly make all decisions, as in a town meeting where everyone has one vote. And because even in 1787, the country was far too large for such a proposal to be feasible, they did not choose to create a direct democracy. Their solution was to establish a republic, a system based on the consent of the governed, in which representatives of the public exercise power. This deliberate democracy encourages these officials to reflect and refine the public's views through a complex decision-making process. The system of checks and balances and the separation of powers favors the status quo. Those opposed to change need only win at one point in the policy-making process, says in obtaining a presidential veto. Whereas those who favor change must win every battle along the way. To win all these battles usually requires the support of a sizable majority of the country, not just a simple majority of 51%. Change usually comes slowly, if at all. As a result, the Madisonian system encourages moderation and compromise and slow change. It is difficult for either a minority or a majority to tyrannize, and both property rights and personal freedoms have survived with only occasional lapses. Franklin was correct that our system is not easy to maintain. It requires careful nurturing and balancing of diverse interests. Some critics argue that the policy-making process lacks efficiency, preventing effective responses to pressing matters. We will examine this issue closely throughout government in America. The end of the beginning. On the 109th day of the meeting, in stifling heat made worse because the windows of Pennsylvania State House were closed to ensure secrecy, the final version of the Constitution was read aloud. Then Benjamin Franklin rose to deliver a speech he had written. However, he was so enfeebled that he had to ask James Wilson to deliver it. Franklin noted, "There are several parts of the Constitution of which I do not at present approve, but I am not sure that I shall never approve them." Then he asked for a vote. 10 states voted yes, and none voted no. Although South Carolina's delegates were divided, after all, but 3 of the delegates who had remained at the convention signed the document. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts and Edmund Randolph and George Mason of Virginia refused to sign. They adjourned to a tavern. The experience of the last few hours, when conflict intermingled with consensus, reminded them that implementing this new document would be no small feat. Alright, I'll be right back. I'm gonna go check how much I have to actually read of this. I don't know what page I'm supposed to stop on. I think I'm there, but I want to make sure. Okay, thank you for the wait. Just checked. Yeah, the reading was just 33 to 44, which we have just done. Thank you for watching the stream. If you watched, thanks. If If you didn't see the stream, but you're watching this after it was posted, then thanks for watching that, I guess. But yeah, I guess that's the whole stream. So thanks for watching. I guess I'll see you guys tomorrow. Hopefully I can get a video up soon.